Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to the first session of our webinar series, China Powers, Dialogues on Ecological Civilization, Lithium-Ion Batteries, and Electromobility. This session will be a series of 3 webinar sessions organized by our ERC project Worlds of Lithium, in collaboration with the Chilean research clusters called Millenium Nucleus on the impacts of China in Latin America. My name is Cristóbal Bonelli, and I am the principal investigator of the Worlds of Lithium project, funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Department of Anthropology of the University of Amsterdam. These webinars are part of the research activities of our ERC project Worlds of Lithium, which is an anthropological study of the replacement of fossil fuel transport with a new fleet of electric vehicles powered by lithium-ion batteries. We are exploring how projects aimed at implementing this technological transition to electromobility are taking place in Chile, one of the largest lithium producers in the world, China, the world leader in lithium-ion battery production, and Norway, a country with the highest levels of electric vehicle adoption. In all of these places, we are researching how technological transitions do not occur in a vacuum, but are strongly and intimately linked to the historical developments of each locality and the particular, multiple, and diverse ways in which technology is understood in these places. In our project, we are interested in deepening our technological imagination beyond Eurocentric and colonial understandings of transitions, and in generating situated understandings rooted in the particular historical relations between each culture and its own technological advancements. The focus of attention for this series of webinars is China, the case study of our project, which has been led by the postdoctoral researcher and fundamental co-organizers of these webinars, Dr. Pablo Ampuero Ruiz.
Thank you very much, Cristóbal. My name is Pablo Ampuero Ruiz. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the ERC Worlds of Lithium. And well, let's delve into the topic. In recent years, China has emerged as a global leader in electric vehicle adoption, manufacturing, and innovation. From ambitious government policies to cutting-edge technological advancements, China's influence on the electrification of transportation cannot be overstated. Today, we're here to delve deeper into the dynamics driving this transformation and explore the implications it holds for the goal of emissions reduction. One of the key concepts that we have engaged with in our research in Worlds of Lithium about electromobility in China has been ecological civilization, 生态文明. This is a policy concept that encapsulates the Chinese government's pursuance of sustainable development. This policy concept does not have a clear definition, nor it's constituted by a set of neatly arranged policies, which makes it difficult to grasp. As it's usual in the kind of decentralization exercised by the Chinese state, local administrative levels experiment with different approaches that travel around and sometimes reach national decision-making instances. Hence, unpacking what the ecological civilization is requires thinking through different scales and settings, and that's what we have tried to do by bringing together the expertise of our panelists. Throughout today's session, we'll be trying to think about ecological civilization through 2 key questions. First, what precisely constitutes ecological civilization? And second, which are the most suitable conceptual and technological tools to think and grasp its nuances? We have invited scholars who have been interested in addressing these questions in their different research endeavors in China, and we're very grateful to count with their expertise to engage with this policy concept from different academic disciplines and approaches. Dr. Steve Harrell, Dr. Anna-Lake True, and Dr. Huang. Each one of our speakers will have 15 minutes to present. After the 3 presentations, we will have 35 minutes for Q&A. You will be able to send your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom or by commenting through our streaming platform on YouTube. This conversation will be recorded and stored on our YouTube channel and website, worldsoflithium.eu, for scientific dissemination. So, without further ado, let's dive into the exploration of China's ecological civilization. Back to you, Christopher.
Thanks, Pablo. So, Dr. Steve Harrell will start the first presentation. Steve taught and researched in China studies, environmental studies, and anthropology at the University of Washington in Seattle. His latest book, An Ecological History of Modern China, was published by the University of Washington Press last year. Steve currently lives in Bellingham, Washington State, where he's active in climate politics and is working on a book about local agriculture. So please, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cristobal and Pablo, for this opportunity. And I shall, I hope, be able to share my presentation here. Can you see it? Okay, thank you. Here goes. I decided, because I'm leading this series off, to talk about ecological civilization in a context of its political place in the history of the PRC. And it seemed to me that you could see ecological civilization, as Pablo has just pointed out, as a policy direction or as a sort of orientation of thinking, or as a political slogan. And since I only have 15 minutes, I thought perhaps looking at it as a political slogan might be most appropriate, particularly since the fundamental assumption that I make here is that the Chinese Communist Party, for the last 75 years, as it's been in control of the Chinese government, has been a developmentalist state. I reject the idea that the state was oriented toward revolution until Deng Xiaoping's reforms began in late 1970s and then switched from revolution to development. Rather, I start out with the assumption that the revolutionary programs of the so-called Maoist state in the first 30 years of the People's Republic were, in fact, programs of development. They were very different in their approach to development from the Western capitalist nations or the world capitalist nations. But one of their main goals really was development. And this is why I started out the presentation with Deng Xiaoping's slogan, 发展才是硬道理. So I'm going to go through briefly the three phases that I see in Chinese communist developmentalism by looking at the slogans that were prominent in these different periods of history. If we think about revolutionary developmentalism, which is what I would call it for the first 28 to 30 years, and if we think about this in terms of how it related to the environment, I would refer to it as environmentally adversarial. And of course, the key book in this discourse is Judy Shapiro's Mao's War Against Nature. And during this time, the key slogan, I think of all, the key political slogan was 人定胜天, or human plans can prevail over nature. This was the idea that nature is a thing that needs to be tamed, that needs to be changed, and sometimes needs to be actually struggled against. And during this period, of course, this slogan of human plans prevailing over nature had within it, at different times, different specific policies and different specific programs that were embodied in a different series of kind of subsidiary slogans. So if we think very early, around 1951, 1952, the Huai River Plain in North China continued to have the historical pattern of flooding that it had. And Chairman Mao famously came out with the slogan, 一定要把 一定要把淮河修好. We need to fix the Huai River. The idea the Huai River is an object of human fixing that we can do, rather than a nature that has its own rules and its own way of acting. And of course, they fixed the Huai River, but they didn't really fix the Huai River. There are still problems to this day. Another one would have come during the Great Leap Forward. And of course, the Great Leap Forward was the world's largest ever developmental experiment and the world's most disastrous developmental experiment. But it was embodied in this slogan that kind of denies the agency of nature or of the environment altogether. 人有多大胆，地有多大产. As great as is the people's courage, so great will be the Earth's output. You just have to think it, you just have to will it, and you can, in fact, bend nature to human will. Later on, or rather, actually, at the same time, it was the so-called three red flags, the Sanda Hongqi, which were class struggle, production struggle, scientific experiment. 阶级斗争、生产斗争、科学实验. The idea that through class struggle, through revolution, we can wage the production struggle, and the scientific experiment, of course, is a way to do this. But once again, it's humans, human nature, human plans, human science versus the environment. And then just a little bit later on, during the Cultural Revolution, again, we have the idea of development. 以两为纲，全面发展. All around development with grain as the key. In other words, we're just going to plant grain everywhere with former forests, former wetlands, former orchards, and then that way we will be able to actually, as they say, solve the warm and full problem. 解决温饱问题. And then finally, during the Cultural Revolution period, we have specific models for this kind of human triumph or human plans prevailing over nature. And 农业学大寨, 工业学大庆. The model of Dajai Brigade in northern Shanxi, where they transformed the environment by their own labor. Turns out, actually, they had a lot of subsidy, but that came later. And then Daqing, which was the oil field that was built out of nowhere in southern Heilongjiang, in order to solve China's bottleneck of having to import most of its oil. So all through this period, we have this kind of revolutionary developmentalism. But as we all know, in 1976, Chairman Mao left this world. And after a couple of years of sort of back and forth, Deng Xiaoping took over as the main leader. And we entered a different period of what I will call Neo-East Asian developmentalism. Which is embodied, I think, best not in any book about China, but in Ezra Vogel's Four Little Dragons, the story of the East Asian developmental state after World War II. And of course, the Four Little Dragons were South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And they later became known as the Tigers. I don't know how dragons turned into tigers, but anyway, they did. And so at this period, I would call the relationship to the environment not so much environmentally adversarial, but environmentally neutral. Didn't really care about the environment. What they cared about was the main slogan, 发展才是硬道理, which was actually not said by Deng Xiaoping until 1992, but nevertheless guided his regime from the beginning. And in other words, try anything. And very early in this period, actually before this period really started, but into the beginning of this period, one of the main slogans was the four modernizations. Once again, development, 四种现代化, that's agriculture, industry, technology, and defense. And then one of the most famous sayings of Deng Xiaoping, and see if I can say it the way Deng Xiaoping would have said it, 不管河马白马，抓到老鼠就是好马。Uh, the It doesn't matter if a black cat, white cat, as long as it catches mice. It's neutral toward the method, it's neutral toward the philosophy, it's neutral toward the environment, as long as we can catch a mouse. In this case, the mouse is, of course, the development. And then toward the end of this period, we have the emphasis on sustainable development. And this is a really interesting thing. Of course, China was a party to the 1985 conference, which produced the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future. And the slogan of 可持续发展 was briefly probably the most important. But the way a lot of local governments used it was not as development, which, in the words of the Brundtland Commission, meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, but development that can be sustained. In other words, we can keep developing. Again, really environmentally neutral and not addressing the environmental question. So when we get to around the turn of the century, around 1998, there were some disturbing developments. Particularly 1998 was the worst flood year since 1954. And particularly in the central Yangtze region, Hubei, Hunan, Jiangxi, but also in Manchuria and in the Sungari River Valley, Songhuajiang, and also in Guangdong. All over the country, there were serious floods. And with these floods, the leadership came to a realization that development was not going to continue unless one took account of the role of the environment. In other words, it would not turn to environmentalism for its own sake, but turn to environmentalism as a way to ensure that development could continue. And so I'm going to toot my own horn here and talk about a key book that I edited with Mary Alice Haddad and Ashley Essery and Joanna Lewis, Greening East Asia, which talks about eco-developmentalism in the East Asian dragons/tigers, but also in China. And during this period, of course, the key slogan is the one that we're talking about today. That's ecological civilization, 生态文明. And now, as Pablo mentioned,生态文明is kind of hard to pin down. What does it really mean, other than being a slogan? But we have a few keys in subsidiary slogans at this time. The scientific perspective on development, for example, this was a slogan mainly during the rule of Hu Jintao. The idea that science is going to be used in service of development, but this time includes ecological science as well as other kinds of science. Huanjing Wenhua, another one that was used particularly in the early 2000s. Environmental culture, start acting in terms of environmental consciousness. And then there are several specific programs or more specific policy directions which embody this idea of eco-developmentalism. For example, sponge cities. A lot of Chinese cities over the course of the past 50 years had become more prone to flooding because wetlands were filled in and lakes were filled in and drainage channels were blocked and so forth. So we have this idea of a sponge city, one that can absorb the water and hopefully prevent floods. Once again, we're working with the environment rather than against the environment to try to correct the problems which came about in the earlier stages. Circular economy is something else. Recycle everything. Never mind, of course, this isn't new. Chinese peasants have been doing this for thousands of years and just recently stopped doing it, but another specific application. And one of the really interesting ones is this yuan shengtai, a different use of Shangtai, in this case to mean really, it's use of Yuan Shangtai, but it's really kind of a shortening of Yuan Shangtai. That is to say, primitive ecology, the idea of nostalgia for a time when we lived in concert with the environment. And of course, it's used to promote tourism for urban people in rural areas, particularly ethnic minority areas. And it all gets summed up in Xi Jinping's, I think, rather awkward saying that 绿水青山是金山银山, that green water and blue mountains are gold and silver mountains. It's a very unpoetic kind of saying, but anyway, it's a summing up of it. Now, I think there's one more thing that we have to talk about, the ecological civilization as a slogan, which is that the Chinese Communist Party still maintains that it's communist. That's kind of funny, but it didn't change its name. I actually thought in 1989 they might change their name to the People's Party or something, but they didn't do that. And then they had the Tiananmen massacre. But, at the teleology of history and contemporary Marxist-Leninism goes from feudalism, feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. But the idea of ecological civilization, particularly, it was formulated by Pan Yue, who at one point was the vice minister of environmental protection, that agrarian civilization during feudalism was an environmental balance. But then we had development, we had industrial civilization during industrialization and in capitalism and the early stages of socialism. And this brought about environmental degradation. So we got to move on from this. Well, we already have socialism, but if we're moving into advanced socialism, what kind of civilization are we going to have to go with it? Well, in concert with this eco-developmentalism, we get the concept of ecological civilization. So it becomes a new stage in the Marxist teleology of history. And finally, I want to point out, in respect to Jesse Rodenbacher's recent book, Ecological States, wonderful book, that this ecological civilization really has in it ecology in a lot of senses, not just ecology to mean the ecosystem or the environment, but ecology as a science. And what Rodenbacher's book shows is that the science of ecology has been used in order to, once again, go back to redesigning the environment, planning and constructing the environment in ways that are human designed and not always in concert with the way the environment might actually work. And his book talks about, particularly in Kunming, how old neighborhoods like this, which are considered to be ecologically bad or unscientific, get demolished and replaced with nice pleasure boats, which are Yuan Shangtai, originally ecological, and you can rent them for several thousand kuai an hour for your parties on the ecological lake. And I will leave you thinking about how nice it would be to float on Dianshi in the age of ecological civilization. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve, for this wonderful presentation. Very rich, historically speaking, and for grounding all the complexities of the development of the concept as a slogan. So we will discuss further at the end of all the three presentations. And for now, I just wanted to thank you very much, Steve. So we remind our audience that you can send your questions through the Q&A function on the webinar, on the Zoom webinar, and also on the chat in our YouTube channel. So now let's go deeper into the issue by learning from the work by Anna Lake Zhu and her presentation that will look closer at some of the practices of ecological civilization. Dr. Anna Lake Chu is Assistant Professor of Environmental Globalization in Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She received her PhD in Society and Environment from the University of California, Berkeley, and her Master's in Environmental Management from Duke University. Anna's work investigates China as an emerging global environmental actor from a critical social science perspective. So please, Anna, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Let me share my screen here. Can you see it? Yeah, good. Okay, let me get this going. Okay, thanks so much, and thanks to Steve as well for that great overview. I think it's going to go really nicely with what I have to say. I'm not going to talk as much about the history of it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about practical implementation of ecological civilization, both in China, but also increasingly globally. I'm going to talk about global implementation of ecological civilization. And I just want to point out that a lot of what I will be talking today is coming out of a new paper that I have out with some co-authors. That paper is specifically about China's nature-based solutions in the global south and how ecological civilization and nature-based solutions go together. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll really just focus on ecological civilization and this goal to build a global ecological civilization, or 全球生态文明. And so in the paper, we focus on how China is building a global ecological civilization in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or really the beginning emergence of these aspirations. But first, I want to start with this kind of demonstration that I give often to people that don't think about China in an environmental way. When we usually think about China, this is what we think about. We think about rapid economic growth, massive urbanization. And this is Shanghai across the span of 2 decades. And you can see the only thing that remains the same is this clock tower here. Everything else is really transformed. So this is the common story of China that we get. This is another story of China that's happening. This is in Hunan province, but really all across the countryside. It's another side of the story of China that we don't really talk about so much. A quarter of the country, the area of the country has been greening in this way, and China contributes to 25% of global greening that has occurred over the past 2 decades. Here's one example. So this is the story of China that we don't know, but it's happening domestically, and it's happening at a scale arguably larger than the country's urbanization, if we look at the statistics, and some of which I'll talk about. But so with that as a preface, I want to just give an outline. We'll talk about what is ecological civilization, building on what Steve talked about, and then how China can begin to engage in this project of building a global ecological civilization. And there I'll give some examples from Africa. So yeah, what is ecological civilization? I think Steve put it very clearly. It's China's slogan, really, for all environmental initiatives that the country now engages in, from protection, biodiversity protection, carbon markets. And it's encapsulated in this vision of transforming the country from an agricultural to an industrial to an ecological civilization, which we've already discussed quite nicely. And it brings in ecology as one of these fundamental pillars of construction that's going on within China, alongside the social, cultural, political, and economic. It's bringing in ecology and making it feature as kind of a key development need. This is a paper from Corleen Goran. It's a figure from this paper, and it talks about these key moments in which ecological civilization, the discourse, really picked up in China. It was first used in 2007 by Hu Jintao as part of a political discourse labeled as a paramount objective in 2012, after which we can see another increase. So the green line here is newspapers, and the blue line is academic papers that cite this concept. And then lastly, in 2018, most recently, it was added to the Constitution. And I believe we would see another pickup in usage of the term after that, although the data doesn't go quite to this point. But so in terms of what's happening, what the consequences of the use of language of ecological civilization as a political slogan, the consequences on the ground, there are many. One of which is the renewable energy, that whole boom that I'm sure people in this audience are very much well informed about. I'm going to talk about another one in terms of regreening and tree planting, which is another consequence of this slogan. And China is engaging in this regreening on a scale that really surpasses any other in the country, this active tree planting. So this is a map showing annual change in forest area using the year of 2015. So it's net change, with a green being an increase through afforestation or natural expansion, and a red being a decrease through deforestation. We see China far ahead in these terms than far greener than any other country. And this is primarily due to afforestation, to tree planting, active government engaged tree planting. This is the country's planted forests. China's in blue at the top here, and alongside the other top 9 tree planting countries in the world. But we see China kind of far ahead with nearly 80 million hectares of planted forests. And increasing over time, whereas other countries remaining relatively static. And here's a paper showing similar data from Nature Sustainability that came out, I believe, in 2019. A quote from the paper: China alone accounts for 25% of the global net increase in leaf area that happened, and this is from 2000 to 2017. So really a big increase. And in the paper as well, it discusses kind of these human interventions, these tree planting interventions causing this greening. And these interventions are a project of an eco-developmental state. They're a project of socio-ecological engineering on a very large scale that has been written about by many people in many interesting ways. I'll highlight here just perhaps the most famous, the largest in terms of temporal coverage as well as spatial coverage over China's Great Green Wall, more often referred to within China as the Three North Shelter Belt, initiated in 1978. It built on tree planting projects that did happen during the Mao period, but then was officially initiated after he died in 1978 and planned to conclude in 2050. So it's a massive initiative if we take the statistics literally. Upon completion, it's supposed to increase the world's forest coverage by 10%. And it very much depends on how you define a forest. You can see here what it looks like on the ground. According to certain definitions, this would count as a forest. According to other definitions, it would not. But in general, the point is that China is planting a huge amount of trees, has done this historically for a very long time, but now is reframing these projects in terms of ecological civilization and investing a lot of money in these. And it's not just to plant trees for its own sake, of course, but it's to kind of prevent against these disasters for developmental prospects, massive dust storms that plague northern China, and then really have huge threats to infrastructure projects. Here's another example of what they do to railroads, to roads. They can't be built in certain areas, and the tree planting is very much associated with infrastructure. It's a type of socio-natural infrastructure. Alongside each road that's built in the northern region, there are trees alongside it in order to protect it from this this type of environmental devastation. And not just tree planting, but other types of activities. This is a picture of working on sand fixation by enforcing straw to immobilize dunes, basically. I guess has been going on for a very long time and on a large scale in order to protect the development that we heard about in the earlier presentation. That was the ultimate goal of the country, of course. And in this area here, this is a historical picture from the 1950s, and here I returned later, and you can see kind of the effects of this. This is in Ningxia, of this sand immobilization that took place. And really, what I saw when I was there just a month ago. And you can see this greening that's happening, and it's very strategic in order to allow for development in the region, to build roads and other things, and to prevent dust storms that affect all the way to Beijing, all the way to Korea, and so forth. That's the historical legacy of it. But now it's very much, China's regreening is very much being used in terms of becoming carbon neutral, using it as part of China's dual goals of peaking emissions by 2030 and becoming carbon neutral by 2060. A big part of delivering on these dual objectives is through regreening. It's through renewable energy, through all this other thing that China is doing very well at, but also through this regreening initiatives. So China has pledged to regreen 33.3 million hectares for the next 5 years. That's an area of size just under an area of land just under the size of Ireland. Yes, and so this regreening is happening domestically, and increasingly it's being exported overseas. And that's what we'll talk about now, this bid to build a global ecological civilization. It's actually been specified very clearly as one of the 6 principles, Xi Jinping's 6 principles for the construction of ecological civilization. It's this last one here. Joint efforts must be made to build a global ecological civilization. And he says China must be deeply involved in global environmental governance. So looking at this greening of global China, we have China going out in 1999, beginning then and going into the early 2000s. We have the Belt and Road in 2013. Then we have ecological civilization as a domestic feature in 2007, picked up by the Communist Party in 2018. Xi wrote his principles. And then we have the impact on the China's global ambitions and the greening of the Belt and Road through the BRI Green Development Coalition, which was launched in 2019. And we're moving forward from there. And there are 3 types of cooperation I want to highlight through which China does this type of engagement, global engagement. One is triangle cooperation through the UN, having the UN, learning through the UN to engage with other countries in the global south in order to export this type of tree planting, anti-desertification technology that China has been very much involved in for a long time, multi and bilateral cooperation, and also, of course, greening infrastructure. So they have tons of infrastructure projects through the BRI, but there's more recently a push to green these infrastructure projects through tree planting alongside the railways, the highways, etc. So I'll end by talking just about one example here. This is a UN program funded pretty much exclusively by the Chinese, the International Ecosystem Management Partnership. They have many different projects, one of which is this joint research on practical technology to combat desertification for African countries of the Great Green Wall. So Africa has its own Great Green Wall project that traverses the country from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. It's very similar in ways to China's project. And in 2017, China agreed to assist with Africa's Great Green Wall building and share the technologies and experiences that they have. And they signed a memorandum of understanding regarding that. Here is a picture of one of the technical and scientific cooperations going on under this Memorandum of Understanding. It's between the Xinjiang Institute of Ecology and Geography and other African partner countries, specifically in Mauritania, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. And they come every 3 years and visit different sites within China that have demonstrating this kind of technology. And they also have partnerships within within Africa in order to build demonstration zones with some of these technologies, such as in Mauritania. Here's just a photo of this this cooperation. When they come, they have roundtable dialogues, but also go out into the field to see sites of tree planting, but also other anti-desertification technologies. And then just one more example of kind of a more publicly focused effort or collaboration. This is China's assistance with Ethiopia's park, a big urban park within Ethiopia that I went to. Many people get married there and have pictures, or they get married elsewhere, but come there to have pictures, as you can see in this bottom picture here. But so it's a huge park within Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and one of the people that I was talking to within the government of Ethiopia who saw this park get built over a process of 2 years, he told me the Chinese come and they built this forest in 2 years. It takes me 20 years or more to try to build a forest, and they come and they just build it. He was very very impressed, I might say, but at this building, forest building that was going on. And yeah, so just to highlight a few of China's emerging diplomatic environmental relations between with Africa. And now I'll conclude. I think I have a little bit of time left. Yes, so I think we went over this. Ecological civilization represents a fundamental pillar of contemporary Chinese society. It has actively been inserted as a slogan which development will occur around. One of the most striking aspects is this regreening that's going on, but also that this regreening is beginning to be shared globally through Chinese-style ecological approaches, what are called Chinese solutions to desertification, and so forth. And within these projects, there's an emphasis on socio-ecological infrastructure, kind of blur the boundaries between the natural and the engineered. It's very different from projects, environmental cooperation in the West, between the West and certain African countries that do focus on strict nature preservation. We see a different approach coming from China, a different approach to their environmental diplomacy. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this exciting presentation on the green and the very emphasis on the greening and the green domestic global efforts underpinning the practice of building a global ecological civilization, what it means to build a global project which is green and where somehow resonates with the environment versus human that Steve mentioned at the beginning in his presentation, and where the human is, I don't know, I was wondering about where the human is in all these greening global efforts of building the ecological civilization. And hopefully we'll come back to that now in the final discussion and probably in the next presentation. So thank you very much for bringing these issues and questions. So in our last presentation, now we have Dr. Ping Huang, and he will invite us to think about this large dynamics in relation to the country's environmental narrative and sociocultural traditions. So Dr. Ping Huang is a research fellow at the Institute for International Affairs of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, where he also serves as the director of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Sustainable Development. His research interests lie at the intersection of innovation studies and economic geography, with a focus on understanding innovations related to societal challenges such as climate change in cities and regions. He is also an associate editor for Transactions in Energy and Sustainability and Asian Review of Political Economy. And he also leads the British Academy project entitled Just Transitions on the Ground, Ecological Civilization in Urban China. It's a question, ecological civilization in urban China. So please, Ping, the floor is now yours.
Thanks for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to join this very interesting seminar. Now let me try to share the screen. Can you see? Great. It's my pleasure to join this seminar. Actually, I think it's really important to seriously to look into China's ecological civilization from different perspectives. And it's really great to listen to the first two presentations that Steve look into ecological civilization as a political slogan, and to analyze the evolution of political slogan, from the very beginning when the party is established until, the race of ecological civilization. I think it make a really clear demonstration of what does ecological civilization mean from a political slogan perspective. And then also Anna's presentation is really cool to present what is China's what is ecological civilization on practice in China and abroad globally. So my talk will mainly focusing on what is the political and ideological understanding and the logic and the rationale behind the concept of ecological civilization from the party perspective and as well as from the society perspective. So I think it would be a really good, I think put together these three presentations. I think we are looking into ecological civilization from different perspectives. So I think it would be really nice to make my presentation and in the end and it can reflect some different insights on ecological civilization. It's really difficult for me to have a really nice title of this talk, so I just leave it as a really simple one, ecological civilization, as Paulo mentioned at the very beginning. There's no very clear definition on ecological civilization from the government document or from the academic research, because they kind of like approach this term from different perspectives. So today I will first talk a little bit about the ideological and the political framing of this concept. Actually, Anna mentioned a little bit on it in one on the two of her slides. So I would just briefly, go through this part. In Steve's presentation, he also mentioned the very important guy who called Pan Yue. He's the former deputy director of China's State Environmental Protection Agency, and he has a paper published in a journal in 2006, which he kind of like, to my understanding, I think is clearly demonstrate his understanding, and I also believe that it reflects the party's understanding of ecological civilization in a really comprehensive way. So here I just put the concept here put the concept here that the Panyue raised in 2006. And to his understanding, the ecological civilization refers to the sum of material and the spiritual achievement obtained by human being, following the principle of the harmonious development of man, nature, and society. I think the reason I love this concept is it do highlight the three key elements in ecological civilization, including man, its individual human being, the nature, the environment, and the society. And in the end of this definition, he highlights that it's very important to understand ecological civilization from three types of relation: the relationship between man and the nature, the relationship between man, and the relationship between man and the society. I think it's really important to put these three types of relationship together when we try to better understand ecological civilization. Because I have to say, when it comes to this term, the focus is always on the first word, ecological or environmental. So it seems that this term is more about ecological protection, environmental governance, etc., etc. But the second word is also very important, because the first word refers to the highlights of the relation between man and nature, or you can say human being and the environment. But the second word, the civilization, I think refers a broader understanding about not only human being and the nature, but also the relationship between people and the people and the society. So I think that's the reason that I think I really like this definition, and I think it highlights the most important elements of the idea of ecological civilization. And I think you can also find the reflection of these three relations in different kind of government documentation and also the practice on the ground. So that's why I want to highlight the definition here first. Then I will briefly go through, the hierarchical tree of China's national agenda and what is the role of ecological civilization in China's national agenda. And have slides that also have a similar figure there. So I would just briefly introduce this figure. I think the most important thing in this figure is that the ecological issue or the construction of ecological civilization has been put as one of the fifth pillars of China's development, of China's national agenda, including economic, political, cultural, and the social. So that means that the ecological issue or the environmental issue related to human being and the society has been put into a very important place in China's national agenda. And that is the very beginning of how China, regard the environmental issue as a very, very important pillar. And after this, I want to also show you something that we all know, that China is a party state. We have like a two very important perspective to understand almost every policy, every national agenda in China. One is the ideological perspective. The second is a political perspective. So regarding to the evolution of the idea of ecological civilization, from the ideological perspective, the very beginning of this concept or this idea is starting from 2006, that when Panyue raised the idea of socialist ecological civilization, then in the next year, this idea has been firstly appear in the report of the 7th National Congress of the party, and then in 2012, it has been added as one of the fifth national strategic priority, as we mentioned in the former slide. And in 2017, there's elaboration of this idea in the constitution of the CCP. And then after that, there's Xi Jinping thoughts on ecological civilization. That's the ideological part, which is really important because in the party say as China, this ideological guidance leads the political strategy, leads the policy direction. So after this ideological construction of ecological civilization, we see there are many policy putting out there, such as in 2015, we have this national guidance and plan for ecological civilization, and then the the fourth national ecological civilization, Paidezo, etc. And there are so many of them after the setting of the ideological importance of ecological civilization. Then when it comes to that, I think it's also really important to understand what is behind the party's understanding of ecological civilization. So why do they see these ideas that important and put it as one of the key pillars of the national agenda? I think when you look back to the literature, in general, there are kind of like a two view of the ecological civilization. One, we call it like the fixing view, that consider this idea, the ecological civilization, as a missing component of industrial civilization, or you can see it's a greening of the industrial civilization, as Steve have also mentioned, and also Anna, that Pioneer's understanding about the ecological civilization is another phase of industrial civilization. But that reflect the second view, the surpassing view of ecological civilization, that see this idea as something that go beyond industrial civilization. And Steve also mentioned that maybe in China, China's understanding of ecological civilization is the second one, the surpassing view of the ecological civilization. But here I have some different understanding of the party's view on ecological civilization, based on my case study on so many ecological civilization project on the ground. I think in China, when it comes to many projects on the ground, as Anna just mentioned, you can see that China's government mainly see ecological civilization as a missing component. So they still see this as under the capitalism, but just the greening of capitalism. So development is still the most important thing under ecological civilization, rather than environments beyond the development. So I think that's something different. So I think China's government mainly apply this kind of fixing view on ecological civilization and to see the environment and the development put it at a similar important way. So I think that is something we need to better understand, because when you go back to the project, to the program on the ground, you do see this ecological civilization project mainly, always, combined it with many of this kind of development project. So I think that's something what we see on the ground, and it's a little bit different from a slogan perspective. So after we have a brief view of this ideological and political understanding of ecological civilization, I would also want to briefly introduce that what do we do? What is the government, and what have the government done in terms of ecological civilization from a policy experimentation perspective? In general, there are kind of like a three phase of ecological civilization policy experimentation on the ground. The first place is from like 1995 to 1998. Actually, you can when you see the name of this project, it's basically similar. They just slightly change some word there, but it basically reflect the similar, or something like a similar project, but they just change the title because of the different kind of ideological framing of this idea. But it really can date back to 1995 when they start this project called the Experimental Unit for the Construction of the National Ecological Demonstration Zone. So then you can see there are a lot of project on the ground, as Anna just mentioned about the greening project. And other than the greening project, we can see some other many other project under ecological civilization experimentation. So we can say that ecological civilization, of course, is a political slogan in China, but it's not only a slogan, it becomes a political reality in China already, starting from like more than 10 years ago, because we start to do this kind of ecological civilization on the ground, and there are so many projects there. So in the third part, I want to talk a little bit about what is behind what we see, this kind of political and ideological framing, and also all this political experimentation on the ground. What is behind it? So I think there's a very important thing which is behind ecological civilization, which is Chinese culture. It's Chinese culture that support the understanding, support the practice of ecological civilization on the ground, and also help the framing of the ecological civilization from ideological and the political perspective. So there's a very key concept, what it called the unity of man and nature, which in China is like the Chinese view of nature, or you can see it as the Chinese environmentalism. It refers to a sustainable and harmonious relation between the human species and nature. And there's a very important thing that here is this kind of understanding is a correlative epistemology that view the relation as the entity rather than the actor per se. So that's something really different from the Western understanding of man and nature, because we view the relation as the key part rather than the entity. So due to the time limit, so I'm not going to elaborate more on it. But I think the one most important thing I want to highlight here is the unity of man and nature is based on the understanding of relation between man and nature, man and man, and man and society, rather than see it as different kind of entity and put it together as a network. That's something really different, because the man and nature, they are, as you can see in Zhuangzi, in Qi Wu Lun, is that all things and I are in oneness. So they are all together rather than separated. So under this, and the idea of ecological civilization at the very beginning, the socialist ecological civilization is built on this kind of culture, is built on this kind of understanding, including the Confucianism and the Taoism. And the idea behind it is the unity of man and nature, and perceiving relation between man and nature as the key thing to understand the ecological civilization. So that's I think the fundamental culture behind the idea of ecological civilization. And because of the ecological civilization is deeply grounded on this kind of Chinese traditional culture. So it has the flexibility and the inclusion when you put it on the ground. So that's why you can see so many projects on ecological civilization, particularly on the ground in the local project. You can see their manifestation is so different. It's very much based on the local understanding, based on the local culture, their local way of practicing this relation between man and nature. So that's also, we can see this flexibility and the inclusion under the understanding of ecological civilization make the implementation of all these projects more localized. So I think that's something we need to highlight here, and I really want to highlight here in terms of the understanding of the role of culture in the co-production of ecological civilization. So in the very end, I would just briefly introduce a little bit my thought, I would say, just a little bit my thoughts on the relation between ecological civilization and the just transition, which so nowadays a very popular term when it comes to the green transition, the green transformation. So I think it's really important because I also have done some research on ecological civilization and the just transition, and it make me to think a little bit more about what is the role of justice in ecological civilization. What should we rightly put justice on the ground in the localized context to better understand ecological civilization? So here, I think I would just give you some of my thought, which might not be, right, to from some other perspective. But based on my research, that's kind of like a very preliminary understanding of of my thought on just transition and the ecological civilization. To my understanding, I think ecological civilization strategy is a means to guarantee a more sustainable socio-economic development. And this sustainable and the continuous socio-economic development is the way to the social justice in the broader and the longer term sense. So when it goes back to the just transition per se, I would say the actual deliver of a transition is the greatest justice. So that's why we need to practice the transition, and to use the localized culture, to base on the localized culture and the localized understanding of the relation between man and the human to deliver this kind of transition, and that will lead to the greatest justice. And I believe that's also what China's ecological civilization has been doing in the past decades, because we are practicing different kind of way, different kind of pattern of ecological civilization practice. So I would just stop right here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ping, for this wonderful presentation. Ping is now joining us directly from China. And well, now we have Ping's presentation somehow foregrounded like some potential tensions between the ideas of development we've been discussing today, as well the very idea of fixing and the division between the environment and the human, but at the same time this possibly like idea of like a cultural background in which there is some sort of unity between the human and the environment. So interesting tensions emerge, and we will discuss about this now in a collective conversation with all the speakers, and we will gather some questions from the audience. Please, people that are connected now, please share your questions or comments on the chat in the webinar Zoom section and also in our YouTube channel. So, Pablo.
Yeah, thank you, Cristobal, and thank you
Yes.
to all the speakers. This has been incredibly thought-provoking. I myself have a ton of questions, to be honest, but I think we should relay the ones coming from the audience. We already have a couple of questions coming in. Instead of directing the questions to specific speakers, I think I'll just present it, and if you're interested or engaging with it, just you can intervene. I will take first the question that was presented by Aysen from our audience, because these dynamics that we are talking today about ecological civilization have a material background in order to build this ecological civilization. And we know this very well because we work in lithium and electromobility. You required certain raw materials to greenify or green your economy and to sustain that kind of development. And in the later years, there has been a lot of debate kind of on this kind of China scare and geopolitical competitions across the Pacific, US and China, and the European Union and China, and their kind of strategy, if one can talk about a EU strategy to China these days. There are a lot of tensions happening in the geopolitical and more broadly often presented as reasons for critical mineral securitization in the West. So the question that ISA raises is, what is the purpose and role of mineral securitization, or in this case, like this securing access to raw materials more broadly, perhaps in the framing of ecological civilization? And what does a rhetoric of mineral securitization or of geopolitical security in this case conceals in the context of building an ecological civilization? Who dares to take this first? It's a broad question, but Anna was engaging with the problem of the global south, and maybe now we should also bring it a little bit to the global north.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take a first stab. I think I don't have a clear answer, but I'll give it a shot, and maybe some others can pick up on it. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of global China, right, and China's influence in the global south, and that is a geopolitical issue. I mean, that is China's environmental diplomacy with African countries doesn't come in a vacuum, of course. It's like overlaid across all sorts of geopolitical interests as well as strategic resource interests. So, I mean, I don't think in terms of strategic minerals specifically, but just in terms of geopolitics, China's environmental engagement and like that sixth pillar of Xi Jinping thought on ecological civilization, which says China will be deeply involved in global governance, has a lot of geopolitical implications. I think there's like the China scare and the fact that China is becoming more and more involved in the UN. These all have, geopolitical implications. And I think that the environment is one way that China can show its global edge, I guess. And bringing it back to this idea of, I mean, I really liked Ping's presentation and talking about this focus on man-nature relations and I see the type of environmental work that China does in the global south as being distinct from that in the West. And that too has geopolitical implications, I think. There's like the fortress conservation that happens that gets promoted by Western donors in the global south has political consequences in that people don't really like it so much. Yeah, so those are kind of along the lines that I'm thinking about, but I don't know if Steve and Ping want to bring something else to that question.
Well, maybe thank you, Anna. I'd like to come back to Ping's last couple of slides about justice. And I think we can think about this in terms of justice on a series of scales. In other words, we have resource imperialism, which has been the basis of Euro-American civilization since 1492, China has tried to position itself as somehow different, China can't be imperialist because it's anti-imperialist. But in the same sense, you see a kind of a tension between green projects and extractive projects, particularly the subject of this entire series, which is to say lithium, and not just lithium, but cobalt and nickel and rare earths and all the other components that go into green energy construction, and so. You get both from the West and from China, you get, and it'll just be provocative here, you get a bit of hypocrisy in the sense that, yes, we're planting trees and that's good, but we also are, establishing mines and ports and even, in the brown energy sphere, of course, so oil exploration has been a part of this more on the Euro-Americans imperialist side than the Chinese. So there's a justice implication here, which of course is part of the more geopolitical idea of, the world is still basically run by Euro-American and maybe Japanese capitalists, and that it's easy to see environmental initiatives as kind of cynical and hypocritical That's not the whole story, but it's easy to see them from this. But then there's also the implication for justice internally to China, because two things are happening. One is, of course, extractive industries, which are continuing, have been going on since, well, since the late Qing dynasty, really, but, you know, accelerated during the developmental periods of the People's Republic. And the populations that suffer tend to be poor, rural, uneducated, and particularly minorities in Xinjiang in particular, but also in the Southwest. Not so much in Tibet, because it's so hard to actually get anything in and out of Tibet, although that's changing. We have 2 railroads now. So, you know, in environmental justice in a sense of poor communities, or environmental justice in a sense of poor countries, becomes a kind of, it's a way of an angle from which to question either. And I think Anna's distinction here is really important between the Western, and not so much necessarily even governmental, but you know, private and NGO, you know, conservation. But this is mirrored in things like what's going on where you replace a neighborhood in Kunming with these lovely pleasure boats, and, you know, who suffers, who was in that neighborhood previously. Or if you're going to restore grasslands in Qinghai or someplace like that, well, because of political economy and because of population growth, nomads, ethnically Tibetan nomads, they have too many animals. Well, ecology as a science, a conservation science, well, these stupid, ignorant herdsmen who are stuck back in agricultural civilization, not even industrial civilization, it's their fault, you know, that the grasslands are being degraded because they have too many sheep out there. Well, the reason they have too many sheep out there is they have to make a living in the current, you know, they can't just be subsistence herders like they were before. They have to make a living and send our kids to school and so forth and so on. So you end up blaming the victim of development, and you use the science of ecology in the service of perpetrating what the environmental justice people would simply call environmental injustice. And so this occurs both at internal and external scale. I don't want to sound too cynical, because they really have reforested, you know, and that's a really impressive effort. But you know, there are less propagandistic ways to look at this question.
Yeah, I just want to add one point, like in terms of now so far, this kind of like a geopolitical concern about China's increasing power in green industry and green product. I think the very first question we need to ask is whose fears? Whose Chinese fear? And fears for what? So far, you know, we see, of course, like Anna just present, in many Belt and Road country, of course, we can find so many, not so many, but at least we can find many like environmental injustice into this BRI project. Of course, that's for sure, because nothing's perfect, right? So that is not only about BRI project, it's about almost every project in the world, particularly in developing country. So I think the very first question we need to ask about this Chinese fear is whose fears. So far we see like there's a strong fear from the United States about China's like increasing power, particularly in the green industry, including the solar PV, the electric vehicle, and what your project is looking into, the lithium battery, etc., because they see this kind of project as the future pillar to achieve climate change and to achieve the carbon mitigation and to enable the green transformation of the whole world. So if China occupy this key product, it will make them, from the capital perspective and also from the national security perspective, that's what they're scared for. So when we look at it from another perspective, if it's not China that occupy these three products, if it's United Kingdom, if it's France, if it's Germany, what will the United States perspective on it? What if it's Japan? Because I think the fear behind it is not only about the industrial and the capital interests, and it's more about national security. It's more about they see China as a communist party, and when the power grow, China will enable to impact other country to turn to what they really afraid of, so-called the communist party or communist country, and to reverse the whole idea of United States democracy and the liberal idea and all the neoliberalism. I think that's the fundamental question. So it's about who is fear, who is scared about China's rise. And I think we do need to grasp, to find more perspective from other country, not only United States, also the European country and also the developing country, that what is their real understanding of China's growing power in all this green industry. That's the first question I think we need to address. The second question is their fear of what? I think I partly touched that question before, like their fear about this kind of more, in the end, it's about political power. It's not about this industrial or the capital interest. So that is something I think, if to better understand this question, I think that's a way that I think when you go back to ecological civilization and all this green transformation in China, you need to look back to the fundamental logic and the rationale of this kind of transformation. What is behind it? So that's why I prefer to look into the cultural perspective. What is the cultural element behind ecological civilization, behind this green transformation? And then it can lead to a more comprehensive understanding of China's rising power in green industry, rather than only see from a political perspective. I'm not saying that there's no political power, political impact from China to other country, but we need to have a more comprehensive understanding so that we won't narrow our understanding up to a very limited geopolitical perspective. So that's my response.
Thank you very much, Ping. And I think this also brings the importance, the very relevance of scale, and the scale of fear, or the scale of tensions, actually, we could think about. So I want to share a question by Thomas White, but I asked the speakers to briefly give us an answer, because we have little time. But it has to do with the issues we've been discussing now. So Thomas White wrote, "We've just heard that ecological civilization is deeply grounded in Chinese traditional culture," in the last presentation of Ping, and now what you were saying, Ping. So ecological civilizations has returned to a past in which man and nature were supposedly in harmony. But we also heard from Steve that, and here is the matter of the scale of the tension, that Steve said that it is part of a Marxist teleology. Are there any ways in which this apparent contradiction is being addressed in the discourse of ecological civilization in China, or does it just reflect how vague this concept is? So, big question.
Short
Steve?
answers.
You want to join?
I would just say, if I had to, was a multiple choice question, I think it's vagueness. is probably what I would choose answer B on a multiple choice test. But the reason I choose that is also because Chinese policy making is always vague. In other words, the center produces a policy and then leaves it to local governments and occasionally increasingly the capital interest to actually implement that policy. So I'm thinking back to sustainable development in the 1990s. One of my students, Li Yongxiang from Yunnan, talked about how every local project of building a road or planting sugarcane or marketing local agricultural products, they always used sustainable development because that was the mantra that was being used at the time, and it was justifiable because it was vague, and you could make a lot of things sustainable development. You can make a lot of things ecological civilization. So there's a intentional vagueness which allows the central leadership to observe how this is working and allows local leadership, either sincerely or cynically or combination of the both, to use this rubric in order to promote a great diversity of programs.
I'll also just add briefly, I agree that it's very much strategically vague, like sustainable development, like many environmental concepts. But one thing that is, I would say, it is more like in terms of it's this progression. It is more forward looking, I would say, in that I don't think it really harkens to a past in which humans and nature had harmonious relations necessarily, but looks forward to create harmonious relations in like some idealistic utopian future. But I would say, unlike sustainable development, or at least unlike some of the kind of Western environmental discourse, it is more, I think, look forward looking in a certain sense, at least.
Yeah, a short answer to the question is, I think, as I just mentioned, I make a comparison between ecological civilization and just transition. I think transition per se is not the end of story. It's a process. It's always like an ongoing story. So that's the same for ecological civilization. There's no final picture of ecological civilization. As Anna just mentioned, that might be a utopian words that have this harmony relation between every human being and nature. And we all know that's not possible. We only can have like a general harmony relation between a majority group of people and the a general environment. That's what all we know. So I think that is really like a forward-looking vision of both like ecological civilization and just transition or sustainable development. But I think the main thing I want to highlight here, as I highlight in my presentation, is really important to practice what we are wishing for. That's the starting point, and that's necessary to at least to pursue what we are wishing for, rather than to set so many constraints before we start to do anything. Because in China, I think not only the government, but also the local, not only, including the central and the local government, they are very pragmatic. And also the Chinese businessman and the Chinese every individual, I think they are very pragmatic in terms of implementing this idea of being more harmony with the nature, with their local environment. So I think that is my short answer to the question.
Well, certainly this conversation can continue for the whole day. We have a lot of questions coming up. I'm going to group last question. It's a bit of a collage of different interventions coming up. So we have been discussing this concept of ecological civilization in terms of policy and of ideology, of politics, and so on. And but probably we should look a little bit closer at also the challenges that it presents for implementation. So when we think about ecological civilization and the way, for example, that Anna was showing with the greening, or Ping was showing with the way that the ideology has developed and how that also has steered certain level of understanding on what kind of practice is constituted by ecological civilization, we should also think about what on the ground, as Ping has insisted, right? What on the ground is being shown. So, for example, Jose Cabello asked, how do you do mining inside an ecological civilization? How do you exploit a salar, a salt flat in Atacama Desert in an ecologically civilizational way? But also you can bring it to other fields. For example, the financial field. Francisco Ordines raises the question, how would you implement criteria of ecological civilization, for example, through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? To what kind of key performance indicators would you consider, for example, for a project to be considered part of ecological civilization or not? And Hui Wen also brings us to the ground. Hui Wen, who will be talking on the next session, by the way. She also raises the question about, well, we have all of this cultural understanding, but in many parts of the implementation of ecological civilization, what she sees is that there's a lot of corporate development, green industrial development that is often driven purely by economic and capitalist logics. She says that she hardly sees companies and businesses invoking Taoism or traditional Chinese culture, etc., to justify their actions. So how can we interpret this? There are these challenges to implement ecological civilization. There are different settings where we can see those challenges: mining, banking, or urban development, as Steve showed, rural development, as Anna showed. But then we also have this other question about what kind of interpretation are we doing here? Are we over-interpreting by bringing Confucianism and Taoism into these practices? That's what Hui Wen raises. So we leave you the last word here before we close the conversation for today with this simple question to answer. Who wants to take the first swing at this?
Yeah, maybe this
How
time
to implement? How do we implement ecological civilization?
I will start first. I think this question is really important, and that is the reality. But I would say that reflect a part of the reality. As you know, the question highlight that, of course, there's no very like a specific indicator of ecological civilization, as just Steve highlight that. Not only in terms of ecological civilization strategy, but also many other national strategy. They're like pretty vague, and they are vague on purpose. So it leaves enough space for local government to implement different kind of project and program on the ground, based on their local context. So I think that's why I think they're very limited indicator to represent ecological civilization, even though we do see some like a green financing, etc. They are setting some indicator in some very specific area, but not a very comprehensive indicator system or something like that. And in terms of the program on the ground, it seems like this kind of culture is far away from what we see on the ground in terms of the reality, the real project. I think that is right to some extent, because when you, as I say before, that China is a huge country with so diverse context. We have so many language, as you might know. Even I, don't understand most of the language in China. So that's the rich culture in China. So when you try to identify, there's also many paper out there, many case study out there. They are looking for this kind of environmental injustice case in China, and they can publish like I think dozens of paper per year, because there are so many out there in terms of mining, in terms of even graining, even like this kind of project, of course. But I think the reason I put the ecological civilization from a cultural perspective is that I think we do need to have a more comprehensive understanding, even on the project on the ground, not only to identify the project you want to looking for. So I think that is something really rare to see, that the people, researchers start to put two different diverse cases together in one paper, and to highlight what the whole picture is there. So I think I do agree with the question and he mentioned, and I'm sure he can find many paper out there to justify his understanding. And also there are some part of researcher will also have some really great case, like Anna just showed that about the greening of the country, etc., etc. So I think that is something, when it comes to environment issue, when it comes to ecological civilization, I think that is something we need to pay attention to, not only in China, but also other countries.
You know, I think it comes down to a kind of not only ethical, but also scientific choice that we all have, which is to tread the line effectively between being over enthusiastic and credulous and being over cynical. That of course things are going to be good, things are going to be bad, and as you say, there are hundreds of local projects, and some of them I think are wonderful, and some of them are complete shams or exploitative, and so it comes down to, I think, two things. One is the biggest slogan of all, which I didn't mention in my presentation, 实事求是, right? Be empirical about this. But the other side is a wider question for the world, which is green development possible, or is green development in itself a contradiction?
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly to that. I do think there will absolutely be a place for large-scale mining in China's ecological civilization. The way the country envisions it, that is going to be there. And the question is, and all sorts of development. I don't think from a Chinese perspective, they're necessarily at odds, but large-scale experimentation with how to make it all work in a way that I think will not be at all romantic or idealistic, and capitalism will play a large role. But if any country is going to do such large-scale experimentation and limit the role of capitalism or constrain corporate influence, I think China is going to is doing it, and is in a position to do it in ways that we should all be paying attention to.
Okay, so this is a very engaging discussion with profound and important questions. Is green development possible? But we need to come to an end because of time restrictions, and we wanted to thank the speakers once again for your participation and for sharing your ideas and research and questions. We also wanted to thank to the European Research Council, who is funding our research, and also to our Chilean partner this time, which is the research cluster called Millenium Nucleus on the impacts of China in Latin America. So, and of course, the University of Amsterdam and the Department of Anthropology that is hosting our project. So we need to finish, unfortunately, now, but there are a lot of questions we will keep on thinking about, and we look forward to welcoming you all to our next webinar scheduled for May 24th, in which we will delve into the role of China in the global circulation of electromobility technologies. So thank you again, Steve, Ping, Anna, Pablo, and the producers that are behind the screen, and to all the audience that has been part of this interesting and important conversation today. Goodbye and thank you.
Right. Right.
Thanks. Bye.